I arrived in Millfield Valley on a Tuesday morning in late spring, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and 20 years of agricultural knowledge that nobody wanted to hear about. The town stretched before me like a patchwork quilt of green and gold fields, each farm representing generations of families who had worked this land since before my grandparents were born. The rejection started immediately. At Henderson's feed store, old Pete looked me up and down with weathered eyes that had seen too many seasonal workers come and go. When I mentioned my degree in agricultural science and experience with sustainable farming techniques, he simply shrugged and pointed toward the bulletin board where day labor jobs were posted. Walking through the main street, I could feel the weight of suspicious glances from locals who had learned to be wary of outsiders promising big changes. Their skepticism was carved into every weathered face, etched by years of failed promises from agricultural consultants and government programs that had come and gone like summer storms. The Riverside Diner became my daily stop, not just for coffee, but for information. Martha, the owner, was kind enough in her own way, but even she couldn't hide the doubt in her voice when I explained my background. The farmers at the corner booth would lower their voices when I walked by, their conversations about crop yields and weather patterns suddenly becoming guarded secrets. By the end of my first week, it became clear that trust in Millfield Valley wasn't something you could earn with credentials or promises. It was something you had to prove, acre by acre, season by season, and I was running out of time to prove anything at all. The only person willing to give me a chance was Sarah Chen, whose family had run a small organic farm on the outskirts of town for 3 generations. Her grandfather had started with just 5 acres, and now the Chen farm sprawled across 50 acres of carefully maintained fields. But Sarah was struggling, caught between maintaining her family's traditional methods and adapting to modern challenges. She found me at the diner on my second Monday, sliding into the booth across from me with a directness that cut through the morning fog. "I heard you know something about crop rotation and soil management," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "My tomatoes are showing signs of early blight, and the extension office says there's nothing to do but spray and pray." I spent the next hour explaining integrated pest management, companion planting, and soil biology, while Sarah took notes on napkins. Her eyes lit up when I described how certain plants could naturally repel pests and diseases, creating a living defense system that didn't rely on expensive chemicals. That afternoon, I found myself kneeling in Sarah's fields, examining tomato plants and soil samples, while she watched with the intensity of someone whose livelihood depended on every decision. The earth here was good, rich and dark, with decades of careful stewardship, but it was tired, overworked by years of intensive cultivation without proper rest. Working alongside Sarah felt different from the cold shoulders I'd received elsewhere. She listened to my suggestions about cover crops and beneficial insects, asking thoughtful questions and challenging my ideas with the wisdom of someone who had grown up with dirt under her fingernails. By sunset, we had developed a plan that would transition half her acreage to a more sustainable system. It was a small beginning, but it was something. As I walked back to my rented room that night, I carried the first spark of hope I'd felt since arriving in Millfield Valley. Word of my work with Sarah spread through the farming community like ripples in a pond, but instead of curiosity, it generated suspicion. At Morrison's Hardware, conversations would stop when I entered, resuming in whispered tones after I moved to another aisle. The local agricultural supply company suddenly became less helpful, their representatives claiming they were too busy to discuss new products or techniques. The resistance came to a head during the monthly Farmers Association meeting held in the basement of the Lutheran Church. Sarah had convinced me to attend, insisting that I needed to introduce myself properly to the community. I walked into a room full of sun-weathered faces, all turning to study the stranger in their midst. Frank Garrison, who farmed 800 acres of corn and soybeans, stood up the moment I was introduced. His voice carried the authority of someone whose family had been feeding this county for 4 generations. "We've been farming this land successfully for over a century," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "We don't need some college boy telling us how to grow crops." The murmurs of agreement that followed felt like a physical weight. I tried to explain that I wasn't there to replace their knowledge, but to supplement it, to share techniques that might help them increase yields while reducing costs. But my words seemed to fall on deaf ears, lost in decades of tradition and hard-earned skepticism. Robert Steinberg, whose dairy operation supplied milk to 3 counties, leaned back in his folding chair with crossed arms. "These newfangled ideas sound expensive," he said, "and risky. We can't afford to experiment with our livelihoods." The meeting ended with polite but firm dismissal. As the farmers filed out, discussing weather patterns and commodity prices, I sat alone with Sarah, feeling the full weight of the mountain I had chosen to climb. Summer arrived early that year, bringing with it an unusual pattern of weather that had the older farmers checking their almanacs and watching the sky with growing concern. The spring rains had been lighter than normal, followed by a stretch of unseasonably hot days that stressed the young crops across the valley. I spent my days working with Sarah, implementing the sustainable practices we had planned while watching the weather patterns with growing unease. My background included climatology, and the atmospheric pressure readings, wind patterns, and temperature fluctuations were painting a troubling picture that seemed to escape the attention of the traditional forecasting methods most farmers relied on. The local weather service continued to predict a normal summer with typical precipitation patterns, but the data I was collecting told a different story. Soil moisture levels were dropping faster than evaporation rates should have allowed, and the jet stream pattern suggested a high-pressure system was building that could lock the region into a dangerous weather pattern. At the feed store, conversations increasingly turned to irrigation schedules and water management. Pete Henderson mentioned that well water levels were dropping earlier than usual, and several farmers were already running their irrigation systems more frequently than they had in years. I tried to share my concerns with Sarah, explaining how the atmospheric conditions were creating a setup for extreme weather events. She listened carefully, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Weather prediction was one thing, but suggesting that the local meteorologists and the farmers' own experience might be wrong was another level of presumption entirely. Still, Sarah agreed to let me implement some drought-resistant techniques on her farm, including mulching systems and water retention methods that would help her crops survive if my predictions proved accurate. It was a small hedge against an uncertain future, but it was something. By mid-July, the signs were impossible to ignore. The corn in Frank Garrison's fields, usually standing tall and green by this time of year, showed the telltale signs of water stress. The leaves were curling inward during the hottest parts of the day, and the tassels weren't developing properly. Throughout the valley, farmers began running their irrigation systems around the clock, but the aquifers that had sustained the region for generations were dropping faster than they could recharge. The old-timers gathered in increasingly worried clusters, comparing notes about conditions they hadn't seen since the drought of 1988. I continued my work with Sarah, but now with a growing sense of urgency that I struggled to communicate without seeming alarmist. The sustainable practices we had implemented were showing their value. Her soil retained moisture better than the conventional fields around it, and her plants showed less stress despite receiving the same limited rainfall. The Weather Service finally acknowledged the developing drought conditions, upgrading their outlook from below normal precipitation to moderate drought watch. But their long-range forecasts still failed to capture the severity of what the atmospheric data suggested was coming. At the Riverside Diner, conversations grew more tense as farmers discussed insurance claims and emergency loans. Martha served coffee with a worried expression, knowing that a bad harvest would ripple through the entire local economy. The bank president started showing up more often, his presence a reminder of the financial stakes involved. I spent evenings at my small apartment, analyzing weather data from multiple sources and developing contingency plans that I knew nobody would want to hear. The atmospheric patterns were aligning in a way that suggested not just drought, but the potential for severe weather events that could devastate crops just when they were most vulnerable. The question wasn't whether disaster would strike, but when, and whether the community would be prepared to respond when it did. The first official severe weather watch came on a Thursday morning in early August, when the National Weather Service issued a bulletin that sent shockwaves through the farming community. A massive storm system was developing to the west, powered by the same high-pressure system that had been blocking normal weather patterns all summer. I was at Sarah's farm when the emergency alert came through on our phones. The meteorologists were predicting a significant weather event with the potential for damaging winds, large hail, and flash flooding. Exactly the kind of extreme conditions that could destroy crops that were already stressed by weeks of drought. The timing couldn't have been worse. Most of the corn was at the critical pollination stage, when even minor stress could devastate yields. The soybeans were setting pods, equally vulnerable to damage from wind and hail. A storm of the magnitude they were predicting could wipe out the entire season's work in a matter of hours. Sarah and I rushed back to town, where we found the streets buzzing with activity as farmers scrambled to prepare for the worst. At Morrison's Hardware, the shelves were being stripped of tarps, rope, and anything else that might provide protection for vulnerable crops and equipment. The Farmers Association called an emergency meeting for that evening, and for the first time since I'd arrived in Millfield Valley, I felt like people might actually listen to what I had to say. Frank Garrison stood at the front of the packed church basement, his usually confident demeanor replaced by barely controlled anxiety. The weather service was predicting the storm would hit sometime Saturday night into Sunday morning, giving everyone roughly 48 hours to prepare. But preparation for what? Nobody had experience with this type of extreme weather event, and the traditional methods of protecting crops seemed inadequate against the forces they were facing. That's when all eyes turned to me, the outsider who had been studying weather patterns and preaching about resilient farming techniques that nobody had wanted to hear about until now. The silence in the church basement was deafening as Frank Garrison finally asked the question everyone was thinking: "Do you have any ideas about how we can protect our crops?" His voice carried a humility I hadn't heard before, the pride of generations temporarily set aside in the face of impending disaster. I stood up slowly, aware that this was the moment I had been preparing for without realizing it. Everything I had learned about weather patterns, sustainable agriculture, and emergency response suddenly crystallized into a comprehensive strategy that could save the harvest, if they were willing to trust me. The plan was complex, but achievable. Using weather data and topographical maps, I had identified which fields were most vulnerable to wind damage and which areas would likely experience the worst flooding. By strategically relocating equipment and creating temporary windbreaks, we could minimize the impact on the most critical crops. More importantly, I proposed a coordinated irrigation strategy that would seem counterintuitive, flooding certain fields before the storm arrived. By saturating the soil in vulnerable areas, we could anchor plant roots and prevent them from being uprooted by high winds. The same water that farmers had been conserving could become their salvation if applied strategically. Robert Steinberg raised concerns about the cost and logistics of such a massive undertaking. Moving irrigation equipment between farms, coordinating schedules, and implementing emergency measures would require unprecedented cooperation between neighbors who had been competitors for generations. But Sarah stood up and voiced what others were thinking. What's the alternative? Lose everything and hope insurance covers it? Her words cut through the room like a knife, forcing everyone to confront the reality that traditional approaches weren't going to be sufficient against this unprecedented threat. By the end of the meeting, the impossible had happened. The Millfield Valley Farmers Association voted unanimously to implement my emergency plan, with Frank Garrison volunteering to coordinate equipment sharing and Robert Steinberg offering to organize the irrigation scheduling. For the first time since arriving in the valley, I felt like I belonged. Friday morning arrived with an eerie calm that veteran farmers recognized as the quiet before the storm. The sky had an unusual quality, too blue, too clear, that spoke of atmospheric forces gathering strength just beyond the horizon. We had less than 36 hours to implement a plan that would normally take weeks to coordinate. The entire community mobilized like nothing I had ever witnessed. Farmers who hadn't spoken to each other in years put aside old grudges and worked side by side, moving irrigation equipment and setting up emergency windbreaks. The sound of tractors and trucks filled the valley as resources flowed between farms with military precision. I found myself at the center of a complex operation, coordinating between work crews and making real-time adjustments as we discovered obstacles the original plan hadn't anticipated. Frank Garrison's leadership proved invaluable. His knowledge of every field and farmer in the valley allowed him to optimize our limited resources and manpower. The most challenging aspect was the irrigation strategy. Convincing farmers to flood their fields when they had been fighting drought all summer required constant explanation and reassurance. But as they saw the results, soil that held together better, plants with stronger root systems, skepticism gradually gave way to cautious optimism. Sarah worked alongside me throughout the day, her practical knowledge of local conditions helping to refine techniques I had only studied in theory. Together, we troubleshot problems and adapted solutions in real time, building the kind of partnership that emerges only under extreme pressure. By Friday evening, we had covered roughly 60% of the valley's most vulnerable acreage. The remaining work would have to be completed on Saturday, with the storm potentially arriving Saturday night. The race was far from over, but for the first time, I began to believe we might actually succeed. As the sun set over fields filled with activity, I realized that something fundamental had changed in Millfield Valley. The community that had viewed me as an outsider was now depending on me to help save their livelihoods. Saturday dawned grey and humid, with the kind of oppressive atmosphere that makes experienced farmers check the sky every few minutes. The Weather Service had upgraded their warnings twice overnight, now predicting winds up to 80 mph and hail the size of golf balls. The storm system was intensifying as it approached, feeding off the same atmospheric instability that had created the drought conditions. Work crews were in the fields before sunrise, racing to complete the final preparations. The sight was remarkable. Farmers from across the valley working together with a coordination and purpose that transcended individual interests. Equipment moved seamlessly between properties, and neighbors shared resources without the usual negotiations about costs and reciprocity. I spent the morning making final adjustments to the irrigation schedules and checking the structural integrity of our emergency windbreaks. The plan was holding together, but Mother Nature would be the final judge of whether our preparations were adequate. By noon, the first visual signs of the approaching storm appeared on the western horizon, a dark line of clouds that seemed to stretch from one end of the sky to the other. The wind began to shift direction, carrying the smell of rain and the electric tension that precedes severe weather. Frank Garrison called a final coordination meeting at his farm where we reviewed emergency procedures and confirmed communication protocols. Cell towers might go down during the storm, so we had established a network of radio operators who would maintain contact between different areas of the valley. The most difficult decision was determining when to pull work crews out of the fields. We needed to maximize preparation time, but we couldn't risk lives by cutting it too close. Based on the latest weather data, I recommended ending field operations by 4 p.m., giving everyone time to secure equipment and take shelter. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere became increasingly unstable. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour, and the wind began to gust unpredictably. By 3 p.m., it was clear that the storm was arriving ahead of schedule. The real test was about to begin. The first raindrops began falling at 6:47 p.m., fat and heavy drops that struck the ground like bullets. Within minutes, the scattered drops became a steady downpour, then a torrential deluge that reduced visibility to mere yards. The wind arrived next, initially as strong gusts that bent trees and rattled windows, then as a sustained roar that shook buildings to their foundations. I rode out the storm in the emergency command center we had established at Frank Garrison's barn, surrounded by radio equipment and weather monitoring devices. Through the static-filled reports from spotters around the valley, we tracked the storm's progress and coordinated emergency responses as needed. The wind peaked just after midnight, with sustained speeds that exceeded even our worst-case projections. The sound was unlike anything I had experienced, a continuous thunderous roar punctuated by the crack of breaking trees and the crash of flying debris. Hail began falling around 1 a.m., stones the size of marbles at first, then progressively larger until some approached the golf ball size that had been predicted. Through it all, our preparation strategies held. The flooded fields provided the anchoring we had hoped for, preventing the wholesale uprooting of crops that typically occurred in high-wind events. The windbreaks channeled the worst gusts away from vulnerable areas, and the strategic placement of irrigation equipment minimized damage from flying debris. Radio reports from around the valley painted a picture of destruction, but not devastation. Trees were down, power lines were out, and some buildings had suffered damage, but the crops, the lifeblood of the community, were largely intact. The emergency measures that had seemed so radical just days before were proving their worth under the ultimate test. By 3 a.m. the worst had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by wind and water, but not destroyed. As dawn approached, we began to assess the true impact of the storm and our unprecedented community response. The silence that followed the storm felt almost as intense as the chaos that had preceded it. Dawn revealed a valley that looked like a war zone. Trees were down everywhere, power lines draped across roads, and debris scattered across fields and farmyards. But as the sun climbed higher and we began systematic damage assessments, a remarkable picture emerged. The crops had survived largely intact. I joined the damage assessment teams as they moved from farm to farm, documenting losses and evaluating the effectiveness of our storm preparations. Frank Garrison's corn, which had been among the most vulnerable due to its exposed location, showed minimal damage. The emergency windbreaks had channeled the wind effectively, and the flooded fields had prevented the kind of root damage that typically devastated crops in high-wind events. Sarah's farm became a showcase for the sustainable practices we had been implementing all season. Her soil structure had held together better than the conventional fields around it, retaining both moisture and stability throughout the storm. The diverse plantings and cover crops had created a living network that protected individual plants from wind damage. Robert Steinberg's assessment was typical of reports from around the valley. I lost maybe 10% of my corn to lodging, and some of my beans got beaten up by the hail, but it could have been so much worse. If we hadn't flooded those fields, I'd probably be looking at a total loss. The community response continued seamlessly from storm preparation into recovery operations. Equipment sharing networks that had been established for the emergency remained in place to help with cleanup and repair. Neighbors continued working together to clear debris and restore damaged infrastructure. By midday, it became clear that the Millfield Valley had not just survived the storm, it had emerged stronger and more unified than before. The crisis that could have destroyed individual farms had instead forged connections between farmers that would benefit the entire community for years to come. The outsider who had arrived with unwanted advice had somehow become the architect of the valley's salvation. The local newspaper ran the story on Tuesday with a headline that read, "Innovative Storm Preparation Saves Valley Harvest." The article described the community-wide effort and the scientific approach that had minimized crop losses during what meteorologists were calling the most severe storm to hit the region in 50 years. But the real recognition came from the farmers themselves. At the post-storm meeting of the Farmers Association, Frank Garrison stood up and did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He publicly thanked me for my leadership and expertise, acknowledging that traditional methods alone wouldn't have been sufficient to protect the valley's crops. The transformation in attitudes was remarkable. Farmers who had dismissed my suggestions months earlier now sought my advice on everything from soil management to weather monitoring. The feed store put up a bulletin board specifically for sharing information about sustainable farming techniques, and Pete Henderson asked me to recommend products that supported integrated pest management approaches. More importantly, the spirit of cooperation that had emerged during the crisis continued into the recovery period. Equipment sharing networks became permanent arrangements, and farmers began coordinating planting and harvesting schedules to maximize efficiency and resource utilization. The community that had been divided by tradition and competition was now united by shared purpose and mutual respect. Sarah expanded our partnership, implementing sustainable practices across her entire operation and serving as a demonstration site for other farmers interested in transitioning to more environmentally friendly methods. Her success became proof that innovative techniques could work in real-world conditions, not just in academic theories. The most satisfying recognition came in the form of practical acceptance. Farmers implementing my recommendations not because they felt obligated, but because they had seen the results and understood the value. Trust, I realized, wasn't something you could demand or even request. It was something you earned through demonstrated competence and genuine care for the community's well-being. The success of the storm response opened doors throughout the valley that had been firmly closed just months earlier. Robert Steinberg approached me about developing a comprehensive water management system for his dairy operation, incorporating both conservation techniques and emergency preparedness strategies. The County Extension Office, which had initially been skeptical of my credentials, invited me to lead workshops on climate-adaptive agriculture and emergency planning. Extension agents from neighboring counties began visiting Millfield Valley to study our integrated response model and adapt it for their own communities. Frank Garrison surprised everyone by proposing that the Farmers Association establish a formal position for agricultural innovation and emergency coordination, with me filling the role. The vote was unanimous, marking a complete transformation from the skepticism I had encountered at my first meeting just months earlier. Local agricultural businesses began stocking products and equipment that supported sustainable farming practices, responding to increased demand from farmers who had seen the benefits firsthand. The economic ripple effects extended throughout the community as increased agricultural resilience translated into greater financial stability for everyone. Most importantly, the next generation of farmers began showing interest in techniques that combined traditional wisdom with scientific innovation. Sarah's teenage nephew started working with us during summer break, learning about soil biology and integrated pest management with the enthusiasm of someone who saw farming as both heritage and future. The partnerships that emerged weren't just professional relationships. They were the foundation of a community that had learned to adapt and thrive in the face of uncertainty. Farmers who had been suspicious of change now embraced innovation as a tool for preserving their way of life rather than threatening it. By harvest time, it was clear that the storm had been a catalyst for transformation that went far beyond crop protection. The valley had evolved into a model of agricultural resilience that balanced respect for tradition with openness to new ideas. September arrived with perfect weather. Warm days and cool nights that brought out the best in crops that had survived the storm and thrived in its aftermath. The harvest that began that month exceeded everyone's expectations, not just in terms of yields, but in the spirit of cooperation that continued to define the valley. Frank Garrison's corn averaged 180 bushels per acre, nearly 20% above his historical average, despite the severe weather. The soil conservation and moisture management techniques we had implemented provided benefits that extended far beyond storm protection, creating conditions that optimized plant growth throughout the growing season. Sarah's organic operation set new records for both yield and quality, with produce that commanded premium prices at farmers' markets throughout the region. The sustainable practices that had seemed risky and expensive in the spring had proven to be both economically viable and environmentally beneficial. The community harvest took on a celebratory atmosphere that reflected the bonds forged during the crisis. Neighbors continued to share equipment and labor, but now it felt natural rather than desperate. The efficiency gained through cooperation allowed everyone to complete their harvests more quickly and with less stress. Local media attention brought agricultural scientists and policymakers to the valley to study our integration of traditional farming with innovative techniques. The story of how a community had come together to weather a crisis resonated beyond agricultural circles, inspiring similar cooperative efforts in other rural communities facing economic and environmental challenges. For me, the harvest represented something more personal than professional success. The fields that stretched across the valley no longer felt like foreign territory, but like home. The farmers who worked them were no longer skeptical strangers, but trusted partners and friends. As I stood in Frank's cornfield on a perfect October morning, watching combines move through rows of golden grain, I realized that trust and belonging couldn't be demanded or even earned through credentials alone. They had to be built through shared challenges, mutual respect, and proven commitment to the common good. Winter planning meetings began in November with an energy and optimism that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The conference room at the Lutheran Church was packed with farmers eager to discuss crop rotations, soil health initiatives, and expanded cooperation agreements for the coming growing season. The Farmers Association voted to establish a permanent fund for agricultural innovation and emergency preparedness, supported by contributions from every member farm. The fund would purchase shared equipment, support research projects, and maintain the communication networks that had proven so valuable during the storm. Universities began partnering with the Valley to establish demonstration plots and research programs that would benefit both academic understanding and practical application. Graduate students arrived to study the integration of traditional and innovative farming practices, bringing fresh perspectives and energy to ongoing projects. The most significant development was the decision to formalize the equipment sharing and cooperative labor arrangements that had emerged during the crisis. What had begun as emergency measures evolved into permanent structures that increased efficiency while reducing costs for individual farms. Young farmers who had left the area for opportunities in cities began returning, attracted by a community that valued both innovation and tradition. The valley that had been slowly losing population found itself growing again, with new families bringing energy and fresh ideas to established agricultural traditions. Sarah and I expanded our partnership into a full consulting service, helping other agricultural communities develop their own resilience and cooperation programs. The lessons learned in Millfield Valley proved applicable in diverse settings, from drought-prone regions in the southwest to flood-vulnerable areas in the southeast. As I prepared for another growing season in the valley that had become my home, I reflected on the journey from outsider to trusted community member. The transformation hadn't been the result of my expertise alone, but of a community's willingness to adapt and grow when faced with challenges that threatened their way of life. The harvest had been saved, but more importantly, a community had been strengthened and a foundation laid for sustainable prosperity that could weather whatever storms the future might bring. Thank you so much for listening to this incredible story of community resilience and the power of working together when everything is on the line. I hope it inspired you as much as it inspired me to share it. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please take a moment to write in the comments below and tell me what city, state, or country you're tuning in from. It's amazing to think about this story reaching people all across the globe who understand the importance of community and perseverance. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of triumph over adversity, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Your support means everything and helps me continue sharing these powerful stories with audiences everywhere. Until next time, remember that sometimes the biggest storms in life lead to the most beautiful harvests.